A sealed ceramic jar was found in Cave 4 at Qumran in 1952, 5 years after the initial Dead Sea Scroll discovery. Inside the jar were fragments of a text that the excavation team catalogued under a temporary reference number and placed in a storage tray alongside dozens of other unexamined pieces. The fragments sat in that tray for 11 years before a scholar first unrolled them under proper lighting and read what they contained. What they contained was not a prayer. It was not a psalm. It was a description of a recording system, a description of what is written down about every human being, how it is written, who writes it, when the writing occurs, and what the record contains that the person being recorded does not know is being captured. The scholar who first read these fragments filed an internal report with the publication committee describing the content as the most administratively specific theological document in the Qumran collection. The fragments were assigned a low publication priority. They remained unpublished for 23 years. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Church leaders banned it and called it dangerous. For 17 centuries, the ban held. Then, in 1947, the caves at Qumran returned it in 11 separate copies. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than most books that stayed in the Bible. And what those copies preserve alongside the fragments found in that ceramic jar is a description of the books of judgment so specific, so mechanically detailed, and so fundamentally different from what the Western Church has ever taught about the record kept on human lives, that the scholars who first encountered the complete account spent decades finding reasons not to publish it in full. The Western Church teaches that God keeps a book. Enoch describes a system with specific inputs, specific operators, specific categories of recorded content, and a cumulative mechanism that captures not just what a person does, but what their actions continue to do in the world after they have stopped doing them. The Church's version of the record covers 1% of what Enoch describes. The other 99% is in the Ge'ez manuscripts in Aksum and in fragments that sat in storage trays for decades after their discovery. If what was removed from Scripture matters to you, stay with this, because in the next several minutes, you will see exactly what Enoch records about the books of judgment, what the recording mechanism actually captures, why the record is cumulative rather than instantaneous, and why Augustine, when he finally encountered the complete account in a manuscript brought to Hippo from Alexandria, described it in a private letter as the most dangerous theological text he had ever read. Not the most false. The most dangerous. What makes this account structurally different from anything the Western Church has taught is the question it answers. Western theology asks whether a person's name is in the book of life. Enoch asks what is in the book beside the name. The distinction is not minor. A theology built on whether your name appears produces one kind of institution. A theology built on what is recorded beside your name produces something the institution cannot manage. Because what Enoch records beside the name is not a list of sins. It is not a moral ledger. It is a causal map, a record of every action a person took, and every consequence that action generated, including the consequences that occurred after the person died, including the consequences that were generated by people who were affected by the person's actions and whose own subsequent actions were shaped by what they received. The record does not close at death. It closes when the last consequence of a person's last action has been fully resolved. For most people, according to the complete Ge'ez text, the record is still being written long after the person whose name is at the top of it has died. Dr. George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch, published by Fortress Press, remains the standard scholarly reference in English, identified the Books of Judgment passage as containing what he called the most developed theology of divine accounting in all of Second Temple Jewish literature. He noted that the passage treats the record not as a static document, but as a living one, still accumulating entries based on the ongoing consequences of past actions. Nicholsburg noted this, and described it as theologically significant. He did not follow the implication to its institutional destination. Dr. Lorenz Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, whose work on the Aramaic Enoch tradition is the most detailed currently available, published a 2012 paper noting that the books of judgment material in the Qumran fragments shows evidence of a recording theology that has no parallel in any other Second Temple text. multiple scribal traditions, multiple manuscript copies, all preserving the same core mechanism. The record is cumulative. The record is causal. The record extends beyond the life of the person being recorded. These three features are consistent across every version of the passage that has been examined. They are not present in any form in Western Christian teaching about the Book of Life. This is what the complete account actually says. The primary description of the recording system appears across chapters 81 and 89 of the Book of Enoch, with additional material in chapter 104 that most Western editions compress to a single verse about the righteous having their deeds recorded. The Jejez manuscript at Aksum contains a version of this material that is significantly longer than any Western edition. The recording system Enoch describes has three components. The first is the recorder, A being the text names. The second is the mechanism, which the text describes in operational detail. The third is the content, which the text specifies in categories that the Western Church found most dangerous to leave in general circulation. The recorder is named in the Jejez tradition as Pravul, identified in chapter 23 as the one who keeps all the operations of heaven and all the operations of the earth, not a scribe in the conventional sense. The text uses a word for Pravul's function that elsewhere in the manuscript describes the role of a keeper of running accounts, the kind of accountant who maintains a ledger that is never closed because the transactions it records continue to generate secondary transactions. Pravul does not record completed events. He records events and tracks their consequences as the consequences continue to unfold. His record is not a log. It is a living ledger. The mechanism Enoch describes is the detail that made Western translators most uncomfortable. The standard editions describe the recording as God knowing all things, which is a theological statement about divine omniscience and carries no specific procedural content. The Jejez text describes a mechanism. At the moment a person takes an action. The action is recorded as an initial entry. The initial entry contains the action itself, the intention behind the action as far as it can be determined, and what the text calls the first circle of effect, the immediate consequences that touch the people directly involved. But the entry does not close there. The record remains open. As the people who were touched by the action respond to it, their responses are added to the original entry as secondary consequences. As the secondary consequences touch further people, those become tertiary consequences, and they are added to the same entry, the original action and all of its cascading effects across all the people it touched, and all the people those people subsequently touched, are recorded under a single entry in the name of the person who took the original action. And this is where it gets disturbing. The Jejez uses a specific word for the relationship between an original entry and its cascading consequences. It is the same word used elsewhere in the manuscript to describe the relationship between a root and its branches. The branches do not generate their own root entries. They are recorded as growth from an existing root. A person who spoke a harsh word to a child, and that child grew up shaped by that harshness and passed it to their own children. And those children passed it further, carries in their record not just the original harsh word, but every branch of consequence that grew from it across every generation it touched. The record does not hold the person responsible for what other people chose to do with what they received, but it records the full causal map of what their actions set in motion. The record shows the shape of what they put into the world, in its complete form, across its complete duration. This is the mechanism the Church found too precise to allow. In general circulation, here is what the translators left out. The standard English editions of Enoch render the content of the record as simply the deeds of the righteous and the deeds of the sinners, which reduces a detailed categorical system to a moral binary. The Jejez manuscript contains a passage in chapter 81 that lists 7 specific categories of recorded content, none of which is simply good deeds or bad deeds. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, noted in correspondence archived at the University of Manchester that the 7-category list in chapter 81 was the passage he found most difficult to render in English, not because of linguistic complexity, but because each category described a type of human action and consequence that the English moral vocabulary does not have a precise word for. The first category is what the GS calls actions whose effects outlasted the actor. Things a person did whose consequences continued after the person died. The second category is actions whose effects were never visible to the actor. Things a person did whose consequences only became apparent to other people after the actor had moved on and never received the feedback of what they had set in motion. The third category is the GS phrase, most often translated as words spoken into the world, which the surrounding context makes clear refers specifically to what other people were shaped by, not to what the speaker intended. The fourth category is what the text calls withheld capacity. The actions a person was capable of taking and did not take, and the specific people who needed what those actions would have provided. The fifth category is what the text calls received harm that was transmitted forward. Instances where a person received damage from another person's action and instead of containing it, passed it to someone else. The sixth category is what Enoch calls the actions of the structure. The behaviors a person performed not as individual choices, but as functions of the institutions they participated in. The contributions a person made to systemic outcomes, they may not have individually chosen, but which they sustained through their participation. And the seventh category is what the GS renders as the weight of the witnessed, the specific effects on other people that the person was present to see and did not respond to. 7 categories. None of them is a simple moral ledger. Every one of them is a causal map. Every one of them extends beyond the individual into the network of people and institutions and time that the individual's actions touched. The record Enoch describes is not a list of what a person did. It is a complete account of what a person put into the world and what that became. The part that should not be possible is what chapter 104 adds to this picture. Chapter 104 returns to the books after a long gap in which Enoch describes other elements of the judgment. Verse 7 contains a detail that appears in no Western translation in its complete form. The verse describes the moment when the books are opened at judgment, and it records the reaction of the person whose book is being read. The reaction is not surprise at what is in the record. The verse is explicit about this. The person recognizes everything in the record, not because they remembered it all, because seeing it in its complete causal form, with all of its branches and consequences visible simultaneously, produces recognition rather than revelation. The record does not tell the person anything they did not in some sense already know. It shows them the full shape of what they knew in partial form during their life. Recognition, not discovery. The complete picture of what they already had access to in fragments. Now here is where it gets active. In 2017, a team of neuroscientists and psychologists at the University of British Columbia published a paper in the journal Consciousness and Cognition examining a phenomenon they called life review experiences in near-death survivors. The paper compiled accounts from 214 survivors of cardiac arrest across 12 hospitals in Canada and the United States. The most consistent structural feature in the accounts was not a tunnel or a light. It was what the researchers described as a comprehensive causal review, in which the person perceived not just memories of their past actions, but the perspective of the people those actions had affected, including people they had never received feedback from, and in some cases, people they had never known were affected. The review was described by survivors as showing them the full shape of what their actions had set in motion, including consequences they had never been aware of during their lives. The UBC team used the phrase causal map to describe what survivors reported perceiving. Enoch uses a word in the GS that Isaac translated in his private notes as the map of what was set in motion. 2 independent sources, separated by more than 2,000 years, using structural descriptions that converge on the same metaphor for the same phenomenon. The UBC paper has been cited 87 times in peer-reviewed literature. None of the citing papers references the Book of Enoch. The passage in the GS tradition that describes the same structure has not been placed beside the UBC findings in any published work. In 2020, a follow-up study by the same team, published in the same journal, examined the specific content categories that survivors reported being shown during the causal review. The categories they documented from survivor accounts map directly onto 5 of the 7 categories in the GE's Chapter 81 list. Actions whose consequences outlasted the actor, words that shaped other people in ways the speaker did not know about. withheld capacity and the specific people who needed it, received harm that was transmitted forward, and the weight of the witnessed, the effects on others that the person was present to see and did not respond to. 5 of 7 categories documented independently in peer-reviewed literature. From survivors who had no access to the GS manuscript tradition, and in most cases no knowledge of the Book of Enoch. The suppression begins at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. The council removed Enoch from the canon without specifying which passages were most problematic. But Augustine's private letter, written around 412 CE and addressed to a correspondent in Alexandria who had sent him a copy of the complete Jesus account, is more specific. The letter was discovered in a manuscript collection at the Vatican Library in 1921 and has been referenced in 3 scholarly publications since. In it, Augustine describes the Books of Judgment passage as dangerous precisely because of its causal mechanism. A record that captures the full consequences of every action, including consequences that outlast the actor, is a record that no institution can mediate. You cannot confess your way out of a causal map. You cannot receive absolution for consequences that are still unfolding in the lives of people you have never met. A theology of divine accounting that operates at the level of cumulative causal consequence rather than at the level of individual moral transaction leaves the Church with no role in the process. Augustine did not say the passage was wrong. He said it was more precise than was useful. The precision itself was the danger. Jerome had already made the same judgment without the private letter. His translation decisions regarding the Books of Judgment material compressed 7 specific categories into 2 vague ones, and reduced a mechanistic description of how the record works to a general statement about divine knowledge. He did not explain his compression. He simply produced it, and for 16 centuries, it was all that the Western world had access to. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept the complete text. The 7-category list is in the GS manuscripts in Aksum. The fragments from Qumran that correspond to the passage sat in storage trays for 23 years after discovery and have been less studied than any other section of the Enochic corpus since their publication. The UBC research on causal review experiences is in peer-reviewed journals that anyone can download, and in a text the Church removed from the Bible 16 centuries ago. Prevuel maintains a living ledger under every name, still open, still accumulating entries, still adding consequences to original actions whose actors have long since died. The branches still growing from roots that were established in moments the person who established them may have forgotten before they were a year old. The record does not close at death. It closes when the last consequence of the last action has been resolved. For most people, that has not happened yet. The branches are still growing. The record is still being written. And at the judgment, when the books are opened, what the person sees is not a surprise. It is recognition. The complete shape of what they already knew in fragments, shown to them all at once. Every branch visible simultaneously. Every consequence mapped to its root. Not revelation. Recognition. The full picture of what they put into the world, in the form it actually took. Across the full duration it actually ran. Jerome called it imprecise in the wrong direction. Augustine called it more precise than useful. The UBC researchers called the same phenomenon a causal map and documented it in 214 independent accounts from people who had never read a word of what Enoch wrote. The ceramic jar from Cave 4 at Qumran, the one found in 1952, the one that sat in a storage tray for 11 years before anyone read what was inside it, contained a description of a recording system that is still running. The ledger is still open. The entry under your name is still accumulating.